Selm for some words on tonight's guest speaker, Bill.
Well, as they say at the BBC, hello and good evening. I wanted to, before I introduce our illustrious speaker, I wanted to talk about the other programs that we have coming up. So today is April 14th, of course, programs this evening. May 12th, we have a program called Oppi's Berlin Diaries, My Quest to Understand My Grandfather's Nazi Past. And this will be presented by Gabriella Robinson, who is a professor emerita of IU South Bend. And this is based on her 2020 memoir. Our presentation in June, on June 9th, is by one of our board members, Ron Fleck, and co-chairman of the program committee. Ron's program is on German landmark preservation in Du Bois, as I say, God's Country County. And Ron is a licensed architect and a native of Jasper. So he is give us a first-hand view of preservation efforts of landmarks there. We'll take a break in July, no program, so go ahead and take a vacation. And we will then resume our programming in August for the rest of the fall. I wanted to also encourage people to join Indiana German Heritage Society. If you're not a member, please join. We would love to have you helping us, working together to support our efforts. What does the Indiana German Heritage Society do? That's a good question. What we do is to explore, share, celebrate different aspects of Indiana's very, very rich German heritage, which goes back before statehood. And that's what we do. And we've been doing that since 1984. And our Stammtisch program, we started as soon as we started the organization, and that's part of the sharing. And what we want to do is educate each other about different aspects. And it can be just almost on any topic as long as the word German is in it. So that out of the way, let me introduce our speaker. The speaker this evening is Nicholas Selm. Nicholas Rudolph Leo Selm. I have known him all of his life because I'm his father. I was there when he was born. Nicholas has always had a keen interest, because he couldn't escape it, of his German heritage. Nicholas was educated at Park Tudor School, and where he studied German. And he also then was 4 years at St. Louis University, a Jesuit school, where he graduated in 2006 with a degree in art and a very heavy minor in history. And he, after graduation, returned to Indianapolis, and he worked for a charter school and then an unchartered charter school, an independent school. And he did that from 2009 until 2017. After 2017, he took a break and he removed himself to South Africa, where he lived for 2 years. And there he was engaged in agricultural education. And then he also enjoyed very much exploring the differentness, the otherness of South Africa, and also picking up some Afrikaans, and of course enjoying the similarity to that of German language, and also exploring German colonial sites. When he returned in 2019, he got a job as the Flanner House farm manager. And the Flanner House is located on Martin Luther King Avenue, which is around 25th Street. So he's the farm manager there. And again, he's involved in agricultural education. He also served on the board of directors of the Indiana German Heritage Society roughly between 2012 and 2017. And he's given other presentations to for the Stammtisch program, one on Krampus and one on rune stones, and then one on the German connection in Africa, especially in Southern Africa, that he observed. and that is with German immigrants as well as the colonial landmarks from the Second Reich with its world empire, or also its delusions of world empire. And he's also played a continuing role as the figure of Krampus and also of Knecht Ruprecht at various times, assisting St. Nicholas of St. Nikolaus. So he's had a long career exploring his own, on his own personal level, German culture and his personal German culture. And so I'm going to turn this over to Nikolaus Rudolf Leo Selm. So everyone, please give him your undivided attention as he talks to us tonight about the Germans of Haymarket, the impact of German radicals in the struggle for the 8-hour workday, and the making of May Day, Mai Tag, as the International Labor Day. Take it away, Nikolaus.
There, I'm unmuted. Thank you for that introduction. This was a lot of fun researching. This is something that I have been interested in for a long time. And in doing research for it, I found a lot of connections to just growing up German American here in Indianapolis, especially spending so much time at the Athenaeum or Athenaeum building downtown, which was a Turnverein. And, you know, when I first started really digging deep into the history of Haymarket, I was surprised and excited to have all these familiar names and locations and ideas pop up, ideas that I had, you know, taken for granted as a kid because they were just all around me. Let's see. Now, one thing from a technical point of view, I am not sure how to advance the slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, never mind. Problem solved. I knew all along. So for starters, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in today. I can't tell if Zoom makes attending meetings easier or more difficult. I really can't. But I appreciate all of you coming through and taking the time to listen to me today. I'd also like to thank the Indiana German Heritage Society for giving me the opportunity to speak and for allowing me the opportunity to explore my own Germanosity growing up. It was something, like I said, you know, I took for granted because it was just all around me all the time, but it's something that the IGHS has allowed me to discover on my own as an adult. Also the Turners. When I was young, the Athenaeum still had a more robust Turner presence. They hosted events there, and the Turners were always very kind to me. And, you know, reading into the history of, you know, Germans of Victorian era, Middle America, the Turners were a very progressive and helpful force in that history. Also, I'd like to thank unions, anarchists, and socialists, because regardless of what your political beliefs might be today, a lot of the rights that we enjoy today were far-fetched ideals that were being fought for by the labor movement and also radical, or at the time, radical groups. Ideas such as the 8-hour workday, which we'll talk more about, having weekends, as you know, not everyone gets weekends off, but even the notion that weekends are, you know, a time away from work, child labor laws, you know, these were all kind of radical ideas in their time that the labor movement and anarchist and socialist groups really fought for. So regardless of what your politics might be, we enjoy a lot of freedoms because of the struggles of these groups. Um, I couldn't really talk about May Day as a political holiday without just touching on May Day as a almost like a religious holiday. The origins of May Day go back, especially in European societies, well before Christendom had taken hold. And in the May Day celebrations that are still going on, especially in rural parts of Europe, there's bits and pieces of pre-Christian European culture in there. The image on the left with the drum and this fuzzy figure, that's a character known as Jack of the Green. And this is, especially in England, this is a bizarre fertility figure that's a holdover from an earlier time. And then on the right is a scene from what's known as Walpurgisnacht, which is the evening before May Day in Germanic countries. And Walpurgisnacht, named after Saint Walpurgis, is generally considered to be a holiday of witches and witchcraft. And oftentimes, to ward off these flying witches, you're supposed to put a pitchfork in your front yard to poke any witches that might be swooping down on their brooms. But as far as May Day as a political celebration goes, often when we think about May Day celebrations, we think about, big state-sponsored socialist and communist countries, China, Venezuela, Cuba, where they have massive May Day parades and speeches. There's an image here from Havana in Cuba. We also might conjure up images of developing countries, Mexico, the Philippines, with, very progressive and militant labor movements. Here's an image from Manila in the Philippines, and also those kind of social democracies of Europe, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Spain. Here's a march from, I believe it's in Kreuzberg in Berlin. But believe it or not, the origin of May Day as a political holiday wasn't in Moscow or London or, one of these traditional hotbeds of leftist politics, but rather it was right here in the Midwest, in Chicago, to be exact, which, for very intentional reasons, a lot of people don't know. And this event is sometimes called the Haymarket Riot, but I think it's more fairly or justly called the Haymarket Affair. I think, especially over the last year, the word riot has been called into question, especially when looking back at the Los Angeles riots of 1992 or the protests last summer. Calling them a riot has a certain slant to it. And so I think the Haymarket Affair is a very fair way of talking about this event. So before we even get to the Haymarket Affair itself, there are a lot of different points in history building up to this that are worth noting. So kind of setting the stage. And the first event is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution started in England and kind of set off a domino effect, especially throughout Europe and eventually North America. But it created a big shift from mostly agrarian societies to industrialized societies. And with this came a lot of displacement and kind of disheartening disassociation. And this triggered a lot of today's modern politics, whereas you had this flood of people from the countrysides all of a sudden being crammed into these ever expanding cities. Also, 1848, almost part of that domino effect, the Communist Manifesto, which was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, bouncing back and forth between Belgium and England. They wrote this definitely as a response to a lot of the industrialization they were seeing. And it works as an analysis, looking at the struggles that were happening in Europe with this urbanization and this industrialization. They were able to look back throughout history and see these patterns where every struggle in history can be linked to a class struggle. And whether or not you agree with this or you are fond of Marx and Engels, there's no denying that their ideologies have become a permanent fixture in global politics. Also, that same year, 1848 was a big year. There were revolutions throughout Central Europe. You can see on this map here, especially in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Italian states and the German states, there was a push. You had this newly minted middle class or bourgeoisie, and they were not a part of this traditional aristocracy or nobility. They were more educated, they were more skilled, and they were better read. And there were pushes and demands for more egalitarian systems of governance. And most of these revolutions ended in failure, but on the part of the rebels, of course. But there were some concessions made, and it kind of signaled the end of this era of absolute monarchies that had reigned over Europe since the Renaissance. But also with those revolutions came an influx of Central European immigrants to the United States. There had been previous waves, especially of Germans. Let's focus on Germans here. Previous waves of Germans to North America, and most of those had been rural immigrants who became farmers, and most of my ancestors were of that rural wave. But after 1848, you had a lot of dejected revolutionaries from Europe that were sick and tired of it and were trying to get out of Europe and come start a new life. And so in Chicago in particular, you can see these pink areas here are areas that as of 1980 still had a high German percentage in them. But in the 1880s, 100 years before this map, this is before you had a lot of Asian and Latin American immigration to the North America. There was a huge chunk of German immigrants there. Also, these dejected revolutionaries showed up in America just in time for our Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and Germans played a huge role in that. A lot of them were radicalized already, so the idea of fighting a war against slavery was very appealing for them. It was kind of a second chance for them to fight for these ideals that they had fought and not been so successful with in Europe. The Civil War also, especially in industrializing centers like Chicago, the war effort meant that wages could stagnate because the workers needed to make this sacrifice for the Union. And with the war also came a sense of unity that was fleeting. Oddly enough, in his book, Death in the Haymarket, James Green points out that Lincoln's after Lincoln's assassination, his body went on a tour of the United States, and on May 1st, 1865, his body stopped in Chicago. And this was kind of a symbolic moment. This was the end of that wartime unity between classes in Chicago and throughout the United States. Just 2 years later, once that unity started to dissolve, the workers thought, we'd paid our dues, we'd gotten the union through this war, and now it's time for us to get a bigger slice of the pie. And so the big issue was, influenced by Marx and Engels, of course, was this notion of an 8-hour workday. And, the big slogan was 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of self-improvement, or here, labor, recreation, and rest. And the Illinois legislature actually passed in 1867 an 8-hour workday law, and the employers refused to acknowledge it. And this was obviously infuriating for the labor groups and the organizers who had fought so hard for this and thought that they had this victory, and the employers just refused to acknowledge it, firing workers who demanded 8 hours of work, and hiring slightly more desperate workers who were willing to continue working 10, 12, 14-hour days, whatever the employers demanded. So this, in one blow, was a defeat for the labor movements, but also it kind of stoked their flames and revved them up. A few years later, another important event happened, this time back in Europe. Following a crushing defeat to the Prussians in 1871, the French Empire kind of had to reorganize. The Second Empire came to an end with the capture of Napoleon III at the Battle of Sedan, and the French Third Republic was established. But the people of Paris, Paris itself never fell to the Prussians, and they were incensed at all their sacrifices that they had made throughout the war, and the fact that they had defended their city from the Prussians, who were literally right outside the city. And so the National Guard, which was made up mostly of radicalized workers, took over the city, and for a few months it was the real life example of this dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx had talked about in the Communist Manifesto. And even though it only existed for 2 months, it gave hope to radicals, socialists, and anarchists around the world that this was feasible, that this could happen. And actually, this is, if you look over here, there's a cute little cartoon that shows the communards of Paris represented as a poor little fly trapped in a web between the French government and the Prussian army, trying to hold out for as long as they could. So yeah, even though that was a defeat, it was also an inspiration for radicals back in the United States. That same year, another massive event happened, and that was the Chicago Fire. Sorry, the Great Chicago Fire. As a kid, I was always told that Mrs. O'Leary's cow had kicked over a lantern, which started the fire. I don't know if that's true, but it's a nice little tale to tell. Because there was an influx of so many people into the city of Chicago, both from the American countryside and immigrants from Europe, a lot of the housing that was going up was cheap and wooden. And so this fire spread very quickly, and it was just devastating to the city. And you can see on this map here, that little red blob is how much of the city was burned by the fire, destroyed by the fire, about 4 square miles of the city. And you can see that's the city core going up north as well. So after the fire, a relief fund was set up to help those affected negatively by the fire. I don't think very many people were affected positively by the fire, but this new ruling class in the city, these kind of Gilded Age plutocrats, were the ones who were put in charge of distributing these funds. And to no one's surprise, they found a way to give a lot of this relief money to themselves. They used it to buy new machinery for their factories. They really, when people were hurting the most, they found a way to give themselves a handout. And it's funny reading this, especially with current politics, there were a lot of analogies. Obviously, like the conditions aren't the same, technology is different, demographics are different, but there were a lot of things that were sounding very familiar, especially after the last 12 months of COVID-19 related issues, racial justice issues, police brutality issues. Yeah, you'll see a lot of threads here that connect. So here are just some headlines of kind of revealing how with COVID relief, people who weren't the most needing of relief were the ones to get such a large chunk of it. So digging in, now that we kind of have the stage has been set, just like Chicago was kind of ripe for that fire with all that kindling there and those cheap houses, Chicago was kind of spiritually ready for this kind of political atmosphere that was coming. So there are a lot of key players, but I've boiled it down to 12 key players here. For starters, there's Albert Parsons. Albert Parsons was a former Confederate soldier turned Republican Reconstructionist champion. He married a woman of mysterious ethnic origin named Lucy Parsons. From what we can tell, she was a former slave herself. So obviously in Texas, a mixed race marriage was definitely scandalous. And as the Reconstruction governments in the South crumbled due to white supremacist violence, it was time for the Parsons to get out of Texas. So they relocated to Chicago, where Albert worked as a typesetter. And after the fire, he became increasingly radicalized, especially after the outrage of, watching these millionaires claim all this relief money. And he, throughout the years following the fire, he became more and more radical, abandoning electoral politics altogether. Samuel Fielden was a Methodist lay preacher who was born near Manchester in England. He was a fiery orator and often advocated for armed struggle against the government. Louis Ling was born in Mannheim. He too was an anarchist, but he was also an amateur bomb builder, which did not help his case in the trial around the Haymarket incident. And sadly for Lewis, he only moved to Chicago just a few months before the Haymarket Affair. So that was a tough move for him. Oscar Nebe, is the only German American in the group, in that he was born in America. He born in New York City to German immigrant parents. He had been worked with gold leaf and silver leaf, but because of health problems, he couldn't work there anymore. So he worked at a saloon where a lot of the workers from the McCormick Reaper Works, which is one of the big factories there in Chicago, would come and complain about their work, conditions. So that radicalized him. Let's get to the next one. Oh yes, Michael Schwab was born in Bavaria. He was a bookbinder, and he worked for a radical newspaper called the Arbeiter Zeitung, or the Workers' Newspaper. He was the co-editor of that. August Spies was an upholsterer and a journalist from Hesse-Kassel in Germany. He was a radical socialist and the editor of the Arbeiter Zeitung. And I would say that along with Albert Parsons, August Spies were the two ringleaders of this movement in Chicago. Spies and Parsons were the go-to guys for this radical labor movement and for the push for the 8-hour workday. Georg Engel was a socialist, also from Hesse-Kassel. He owned a toy shop in Chicago. Adolf Fischer was from Bremen, which at the time was Freistaat Bremen, like an independent city. He worked also at the Arbeiter Zeitung in Chicago. And then, so those are the main 8. Those 4, Parsons, Fielden, Ling, Nebe, Schwab, Spies, Engel, and Fischer were the Haymarket 8, if you want to give them that name. So they were the anarchists who were arrested and charged with the bombing in the trial that we're going to get to soon. And then there are 4 other players that are key. Carter Harrison, also named as Carter Henry Harrison, who was a cousin to William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison, was the mayor of Chicago at the time. He was sympathetic to labor issues. He was sympathetic to progressive issues. And he famously, when the Haymarket rally was happening, he attended just by himself, and he found it to be a peaceable gathering of angry workers. So he left. And actually, he testified in defense of the anarchists at the trial later. Also, John Peter Altgeld was the governor of Chicago starting in 1893. So he became governor after the trial, but he was German born. And again, like Carter Harrison, he was sympathetic to labor issues and immigrant issues and progressive issues. So he actually ended up pardoning 3 of the Haymarket 8. John Bonfield, he's, okay, I'm biased. He's a real bad guy in all of this. He was the police inspector who had the most confrontations with the labor movement. And he did a lot of agitating and provoking of the labor movement. His idea behind a lot of this was job security. If he could create a constant threat to big, rich employers, then he was guaranteed work, money, and political support from these plutocrats in the city. So he was really looking out for himself and got a lot of people hurt and killed in the process. And probably the most interesting character out of all of these, I know this is supposed to be about Germans, but Lucy Parsons is such a fascinating character. because as you can tell, she's the only woman in this group of players, and she's the only person of color. Um, while she in her lifetime denied being of African American origin, she claimed to have been indigenous and Mexican. But from what records we can gather, she was indeed born into slavery in 1851 in Virginia, and then moved to Texas, where she met Albert Parsons, and after the war was freed. Um, and she became just this fiery figure. Even after the trial and the execution of the anarchists, Lucy carried on their legacy. And even after there was kind of a divorce between the anarchist socialist movement and the labor movement, and Lucy really kept the ball rolling. She would go on to be a co-founder of the International Workers of the World, or sorry, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. She was described by the Chicago police as being more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. And she lived into the 1940s and was just this constant figure. She just dedicated her life to revolutionary struggle, and saw so many changes. She lived through the Russian Revolution, and she lived into World War II as well. But that's a presentation for a whole nother time. So in Chicago, because there was such a heavy German population, there were, of course, multiple German language newspapers. And today, last time I checked, when I first started researching, there were at least 2 German language newspapers still in circulation in Chicago. And the Chicago Arbeiterzeitung had quite a good run, 1877 and 1931. And obviously the name, the workers' newspaper, it stayed a progressive labor activist voice in the German-speaking community. And also in doing this, I wanted to connect what I was researching back to Indianapolis and what was going on here. Indianapolis had a large German-speaking population as well during this period, but Indianapolis was a smaller city. Remember, Indianapolis, at this time was only a few decades old, and it just wasn't the industrial center that Chicago was. Nor did it have the draw. We're on a non-navigable river, as opposed to this massive freshwater inland sea with all the shipping that comes with that. But I did find there was one surviving German language newspaper at the time of the Haymarket Affair. Oh, sorry. Before I get to the Indianapolis paper, this flyer here was printed by the Arbeiterzeitung after a strike event outside of the McCormick Reaper Works, where police opened fire on workers, killing several of them. August Spieß went back to the Arbeiterzeitung offices and hastily printed off a flyer because he wanted to organize a rally for the following night, May 4th. So if you look at the more yellowed one on the left, you can see at the bottom, and it's the top is in English and the bottom is in German. You can see it says, "Working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force." So this was an early draft, and Spieß and his ed board decided that they didn't want that message on it. So a few of these flyers did make it out into circulation, calling for an armed crowd. But the one on the right is the one that was mass circulated, which has the "arm yourselves" line removed. But it's worth noting that that's how heavy the German-speaking population of Chicago was at the time, that it was split English-German. There were just so many German speakers and German-born radicals, laborers living in Chicago at the time. Now, this is the Indiana Tribune, which was a newspaper that operated from 1878 to 1907, so not as long of a run as the Arbeiterzeitung, but this was the longest lasting German language newspaper in Indianapolis. And the layout of these papers, in comparison to how newspapers are laid out today, with one big headline and a large graphic or photograph, this is just all text. And you can see, if you look right in the middle, it says Blut und Dynamit, so blood and dynamite. So this is the May 5th, 1886 front page of the Indiana Tribune, and it is covering the Haymarket Affair that happened the previous night in Chicago. So I just thought that was really cool. I don't know if Steve Schmidt is on here, but I was able to find this through the digitized German newspaper archives at the State Library. So thank you, Steve. I was paying attention all those times you talked about that. Another big part of German culture in Chicago at the time was when these, what we call them 48ers, all these German immigrants that came after the revolutions of 1848. Like I mentioned earlier, they were more educated, they were more skilled than a lot of the rural agricultural immigrants from Germany that had come before. So when they came, they brought with them this German style of social club. So these social clubs revolved around hunting, around singing, around dancing, around music. And one that, I have a connection to are the Turnvereins. And the Turnvereins were, for those of you that don't know, were a series of clubs that revolved around gymnastics. And I know that might sound kind of silly now, but gymnastics as a discipline was a relatively new idea. And it wasn't just a physical exercise, it was a mental exercise as well. So a lot of cities, especially in the Ohio River Valley, in Middle America, St. Louis, Wheeling, Louisville, had Turnvereins, but Chicago also had several Turnvereins. And in 1876 and 1877, there was this railroad strike in Chicago. So there was another climax. There were many climaxes to the labor scene, and they're still going on. But there was this climax in 1877 where at this Turnverein, there was a group of furniture makers who were negotiating with their employers about wages and how long their workday was going to be. And meanwhile, out in the streets, part of this railroad strike was going on, and the police were fighting with strikers in the streets. And the police just saw this Turnverein and just knew that it was packed with radical Germans. So the police just barged in, stormed into this Turnverein, and started fighting with the furniture makers inside. And it was an all-out brawl, like a scene from Gangs of New York or something like that. And you can see this this cool illustration here shows a lot of people getting choked and punched. So yeah, that was 1877, which just showed how volatile Chicago society was and how the police kind of viewed this immigrant community as others, as a threat, not playing ball. So even during the civil meeting between furniture makers and their employers, the police thought it was acceptable to just barge in and start fighting. On the more radical side of these German clubs was the Lehr- und Wehrverein, which literally means the Reading and Defense Club. So this was basically an educated, radical German militia that would march through the streets of Chicago armed, kind of as a way to show the police, like, hey, we're not totally defenseless, we're armed, and we know how to use these weapons, and we will defend ourselves. And at the time, this came as a shock to the police and those kind of ruling class elites there in Chicago, who did not like the idea of foreign-born radicals marching through the streets armed. And so this was a big test for Second Amendment gun rights in the United States, because there were Supreme Court cases about trying to shut down the Lehr und Fahrverein to stop them from parading around Chicago armed, which was kind of a foreshadowing of what would happen nearly a century later with the Black Panthers marching armed in California. So that's kind of the background, some of the key players, and just the landscape of what it was in a heavily Germanicized Chicago, but kind of connecting that to why May Day was chosen as this significant date. So in 1886, there was a nationwide strike as the labor movement tried again to come back to this 8-hour work campaign. So throughout the country, 100,000 workers marched off the job at various factories and in various industries. And in Chicago, there were thousands of striking workers because, again, Chicago was this massive industrial center. And by the end of May 1st, most workers called it a victory. There had been no violent crackdown from the police or the government. No scabs had been called in. They were able to shut down work at a lot of these major factories. And yeah, German anarchists and socialists and labor organizers celebrated. To them, it was like their Emancipation Day. But the factory owners knew that there were people slightly more desperate than their own workers who were on strike. So they put out the call for scabs. And so this meant that the strikers had to go back to the picket lines to try to stop the scabs from going into the factories. So May 3rd at the McCormick Reaper Works, which is in the heart of Chicago, police attacked the striking workers this time, killing several of them. And that's what sent Spies and Engel and Fischer back to the Arbeiterzeitung office to print the flyer calling for a rally at the Haymarket. So May 4th, 1886, this gathering takes place. It's a peaceful rally, and I mentioned earlier that Mayor Harrison was in attendance at the rally, and he, heard angry speeches, but no one was calling for violence. No one was visibly armed, and so Mayor Harrison left. And as he was leaving, he saw that there were lots of police gathered around the corner, and he said to them, "Go home. This is a peaceful rally. If you show up, it's just going to become violent." So Mayor Harrison went home, but the police did not heed his warning. And later in the evening, the police approached the Haymarket and said that they were breaking it up, told everyone to go home. At the time, Samuel Fielding was speaking, and he said, "But why are you breaking up our rally? It's peaceful. We're not doing anything." And at that point, a bomb was thrown. No one knows who made the bomb or who threw the bomb, but a bomb was thrown in between the police and the gathered workers. The bomb went off, and the police, in the confusion, opened fire. And when it was over, there were several dead policemen and several dead workers. Later, most of the policemen were killed by friendly fire just in the confusion and the chaos. And immediately after that, the next day, the police used the bomb throwing as an excuse to just go after any and all labor groups, radical groups, immigrant groups, anarchist, socialist groups, especially. And just not to delve too much into it, but there was this whole racket of once the police had really arrested any actual anarchists and socialists, remember it was about job security for the police, they began staging more fake anarchist gatherings that they could bust up to just make it look like they were still a vital and valuable force in the city, even though there was no real threat left anymore. So after a lengthy, this was the trial of the century in these, closing years of the 19th century. The trial of those Haymarket 8 was so dramatic and such a spectacle for people because there was no good case against any of those 8. Even Ling, who was like an amateur bomb maker, there was no good case against any one of those 8 anarchists for having actually thrown the bomb. So what basically it came down to was this was putting anarchism and socialism themselves on trial. So the charge against August Spies was that he was just there. And since he was the editor of the Arbeiter Zeitung, that he had fomented these radical and militant feelings that had led to the bomb being thrown. So therefore, all 8 of the anarchists were found guilty. Fischer, Engel, Spies, and Parsons were sentenced to death. Well, they were all sentenced to death, but Fielden, Schwab, Nebe were able to get their sentences commuted by then Governor Oglesby. Ling, not wanting to be executed, had a comrade smuggle one of his homemade blasting caps into his cell, and he bit down on it and committed suicide by blasting cap. The 4 remaining anarchists refused to have their sentences commuted because they didn't want to. They felt like by begging to have their sentences commuted, they were kind of admitting that they had done something wrong and that they were sorry for it. So they remained true to their beliefs until their hanging on November 11th of the following year. Even though the deaths of the anarchists following the Haymarket Affair really slowed down a lot of the labor movement, and it fractured the labor movement from the anarchist and socialist movements. And from that point on, the two were no longer intertwined, and you could see the American labor movement kind of went in a different direction after that. But back in Europe and in especially Spanish-speaking countries, these German Americans became martyrs, and you can see here this Spanish language poster on the right commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Haymarket Affair. And on the left is this kind of beautiful, I guess, nouveau-ish poster kind of honoring the martyrs of Chicago. So in 1890, the Second International, which was a group of international socialist and labor groups, they set May 1st as a day to kind of reignite the push for the 8-hour workday. So, they were looking back at the strike in 1886 that started on May 1st, but also kind of the seismic event of the Haymarket Affair that all kind of started, even though the Haymarket Affair happened on May 4th, those events were like set into motion by the strike that started on May 1st. Then in the United States in 1916, the Adamson Act was the first law on the books that set aside an 8-hour workday, albeit only for railroad workers. But in 1932, part of the New Deal, the Fair Labor Standards Act expanded the 8-hour workday for about 20% of the country. Sadly, today, the 8-hour workday doesn't seem so relevant, even though it's still important. But now, everyone has iPhones and email and stuff. So the workday really follows us. The workday follows us wherever we go. So it's not so important. And then in Chicago today, there are 3 memorials that touch upon the Haymarket Affair. There is the Haymarket Martyrs Monument that commemorates the martyrs of Haymarket. And this has been kind of a pilgrimage site for anarchist socialists and labor groups. And at May Day, there's all kinds of events that are there and gatherings around this monument. Then at the site of the bomb throwing and the rally, there is this abstract Haymarket Memorial that is supposed to represent the wagon that Fielding was standing on and speaking from at the time that the bomb was thrown. And this picture only shows one plaque there at the bottom right corner. But when I visited this memorial in 2016, I walked all the way around it, and different labor groups and socialist groups from around the world, Japan, Sweden, Mexico, Germany, have all placed their own plaques around the base of this memorial. It's very interesting. And it just shows how this event in Chicago in the late 19th century had this ripple effect throughout the world and is still such an important event that most Americans don't know about, because whereas the rest of the world celebrates May Day or Labor Day on May 1st in connection with this 8-hour workday push, but also because of this Haymarket Affair, the rest of the world sees May 1st as Labor Day. But there was a very intentional effort in the United States to distance our labor movement from this Haymarket Affair. And I understand it was a wise move on the part of the government to do that. Otherwise, you would have school children having to learn about anarchism and socialism to give them a reference point for why May 1st is May Day. So instead, it's usually the first Monday of September is the American Labor Day. The third memorial is the Haymarket Police Memorial, which I believe is the most destroyed monument in America that I know of. I know in the early 20th century, a streetcar operator intentionally derailed his train and crashed it into the monument, destroying it because he was sick and tired of staring at that cop, he said, because he had to pass it over and over again on his route through the city. And then in the early 1970s, the Weather Underground placed a bomb between the police officer's legs and blew it up. The monument was rebuilt and is now safely displayed behind the gates at police headquarters there in Cook County. And throughout my research for this, there were just so many parallels between events that were happening today, events that like I don't really need to connect the dots for you. I think just from listening to the circumstances, the political climate, the tensions that were happening in 1886. Like, yes, things have changed and evolved from then until now, but a lot of these things remain the same. So yeah, just a lot to think about, and yeah, it's really interesting to see how history can be really cyclical in that regard. And I also like that this is Mr. McCormick here, and this is Jeff Bezos. I thought having their heads side by side was a cool a cool juxtaposition. Thank you all for coming and listening. Yeah. I guess, is there time for questions, Brian? I don't know. I didn't look at the phone.
Yeah, there's time for some questions.
Okay.
Like if you want to unmute and ask Nico a question or two about the Haymarket Affair, please go ahead.
Gotta go.
Whereabouts are those memorials located in Chicago?
I don't know where the police headquarters are, but that's where you'll find the police memorial. And the Haymarket Martyrs Memorial is, I'm looking up the name, it's in Forest Home Cemetery in Forest Park, Illinois, which is like an immediate suburb of Chicago. So I have not been there, but I did go to the Haymarket Memorial with the red wagon.
Doing a quick look, it looks like the Haymarket Police Memorial is on the south side of Chicago on
Okay.
Michigan Ave.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Thank you for that follow-up.
Anything else for Nico?
Well, I just wanted to say, in Germany, May Day is a national holiday, and I think that's pretty normal across most countries. And the other thing I wanted to say is that Nico, I really liked the presentation, and Nico introduced a lot of kind of cool personalities. And one of them, it was John Peter Altgeld, the governor of Illinois, and he was a German American. He was not a 48er. He grew up in a Catholic family in rural Ohio, and then kind of ended up in Chicago, became a lawyer, a real estate investor. He did really well for himself. And he was a labor reformer too, but more of a moderate, a centrist. And he, of course, is the person who pardoned the people that survived. And so he got punished for that. He was basically hunted out of office, but he's a person that is worth remembering in the German American pantheon of heroes. He's probably the most prominent German American politician besides Karl Schurz, but he was forgotten because of the pardon. He really became a person non grata in America, and when he ran for re-election, he was defeated. But he was really the early standard bearer of the progressive movement, and he stood for labor reform. He stood for workplace safety, child labor laws, prison reform. He's really a prominent person, so I'm really glad Nico mentioned him. I mean, he's really yeah.
I go on that note. One of my references while researching was the aptly titled Forgotten Eagle, which is the biography of Altgeld. And my father got this for me when he noticed that I was delving into Haymarket research. But yeah, definitely a forgotten figure. And you're right. He stuck to his guns and he paid the price politically for that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought him up. And I also thought of a second thing. I'm talking a lot, sorry. But I thought of, if we think about this in terms of American labor history, before the Haymarket Affair, we had the Knights of Labor, and they were a bit, disorganized. They had a weak structure, but they were an industrial union. They were trying to be an industrial union. They had a few successes. And of course, the 8-hour day was the most important thing. And then after the Haymarket Affair, we have the rise of the American Federation of Labor. And that's a very different organization. It's a craft union, movement. So what we have is people that are craftsmen, people with specialized skills. Those are organized in those unions. There's no attempt to organize people that are not people with specialized skills. And so if we look at the 1880s, we can see it's a time of, it's a depression, and it's very hard to organize along industrial lines. And there's something else going on. It's actually hurt German Americans. German Americans were overrepresented in the group of craftsmen, of people with skills, but industry kind of reorganized. There was less of a need for craftsmen with special skills. There was more of a need with people with some skills that worked in these big factories. And so we can see that this kind of hurt German Americans as an ethnic group. There was a resorting of American society, and German Americans kind of fell down the social ladder. And that's something that we often don't talk about. We think of our history as one of being upward mobility, but the 1880s and the 1890s were kind of a period when there was a decline, like other groups kind of did better. Thanks.
Thank you, Heiko.
So thank you, Nico. I just wanted to, I'm managing the chat here for you, and you're getting a lot of compliments. Judith Goodwin, Edward Schoenfeld, Craig Mintz, Claudia, and Al Hurd, all the compliments. And then Claudia asks about the fallout in other heavy German American areas of the country. So it was an issue in Chicago. There was a big fallout, probably permanently damaged the reputation of German Americans within Chicago, or affected it, I should say. What about places like New York? I know in Milwaukee, most of our people weren't there yet by then, or at least a fair number. I don't know about New York and other places. So if you could comment about other areas where German American communities were quite large and the fallout it may have had there.
Maybe Heiko can speak more to that, but I think the fallout from that affected German Americans in the sense that not that they were German Americans, but just the German Americans that were a part of this labor movement or this anarchist socialist activist movement. I think that's where they were affected the most. But, I was so hyper focused on Chicago and to a lesser extent, Indianapolis, but I couldn't really speak on if there was a direct impact there. But since Chicago was this industrial center, it definitely kind of set the tone. So if the scene in Chicago was weak, then the scene in Milwaukee, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio would be weak as well. But if it was strong in Chicago, then I would imagine that would be stronger in those cities as well. Heiko, do you know anything about that to kind of fill in those gaps?
I'm not really, a person that could speak authoritatively on this. I think Milwaukee is kind of an interesting place in that, we can see that locally the Social Democrats were very strong. They controlled the city government. And so they were identified as socialists. And Milwaukee, subsequently elected several socialist members of Congress, but Congress refused to seat them. You know, they were not allowed to participate. So it's kind of an interesting history that's kind of forgotten. But yeah, they ran like the city of Milwaukee, the municipal government, for several decades, I think. It was like squeaky clean, but it didn't really, it's not something that surfaces in a lot of other places.
And a strong component for the foundation of the Progressive Party that came maybe a decade or so later, also from that movement in Milwaukee, Bob La Follette and others.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think your judgments are really, I think, right on target. I would agree with everything you're saying, Nico. I mean, you know, also that Chicago is this big symbol of labor. You know, if we think of the stockyards, if we think of Carl Sandburg's poem, City of Broad Shoulders, you know, it always just, I totally agree with you, you know, everything you said.
Thank you. There's another poem. It's by Nelson Algren. It's called Chicago, a City on the Make. And it's, you know, was, I believe, written in the late 50s. And it's kind of like a free form epic poem about the history of Chicago. And it touches on the Haymarket riots, but it's a love note to Chicago, but it's also very disparaging. And the part of the poem when he's touching on the Black Sox scandal, where the Chicago White Sox like threw the World Series for betting purposes, Algren compares the city of Chicago to that, in saying that the whole city throughout its history has been one giant rigged ball game, saying that, you know, there's always these people in power who are pulling the strings, and you know, the rest of the city is just kind of cowering underneath the L tracks. Yeah, so it's actually a really beautiful book, even though it's kind of disparaging in its descriptions of Chicago. But yeah, it talks about this constant labor struggle and you know, constant labor defeats, but also these small victories that have helped push not only Chicago, but the rest of the country forward, you know, incrementally and slowly, but forward.
Also from the chat, Consul General Missinger gives you compliments and very inspiring, he says, and that he's, based upon this, going to be visiting these memorials in Chicago, since that's where his office is. So I think that comes as pretty high praise. More compliments, Eric and Cherie, thank you. And William Marola agreeing with your assessment about the effects of this, this being a blow more on the radicalism movement than the German community per se.
Excellent. Anything else for Nico? Okay, if not, again, thanks for joining us for this very interesting program. Thank you, Nico. Thank you so much. Please join us next month for our next Stammtisch. And also, this program will be uploaded onto ighs.org in about a week's time. So if you miss parts of it or want to refresh your memory on it, it'll certainly be there in Cyberland. And lastly, if you're not a member of IGHS, we encourage you to become a member and to have our continued programming, such as tonight, to continue forward. Bill, any final thoughts?
Any final thoughts?
Do we type it in or speak it?
No,
You're on.
You're on. All right. Very good. Thanks. I wanted to thank our speaker tonight and ask everyone to, as you said, Brian, join Indiana German Heritage Society, and then join us for the other programs in May and June. We'll take a break in July and then resume with some very, very exciting programs for the Stammtisch in the fall. All right, so I'll just say thank you and good night.
Yes. Thank you.
Everyone,
Great.
thank you for tuning in.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Nico.
Nico.